Well, a landmark deal has been reached at COP29 on the global carbon market. Countries participating in the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Azerbaijan approved carbon credit standards as an important step in the creation of an international emissions trading system. The consensus was reached in line with the 2015 Paris Agreement. Carbon credits represent a ton of carbon dioxide or equivalent greenhouse gas emissions reduced or avoided. But for more on this, on COP29, we're joined in studio by the Director of Global Change Institute at University of Witwatersrand, of Wits University, Professor Francois Engelbrecht. Prof, great to have you. Thanks very, very much for coming in. So all of this is very sort of technical when we talk about, emissions and big deals that have been signed. So I want you to help us understand this better and what it would mean for us. So, I mean, after years of talks, no action, this global carbon market seems like it's taking shape from what I've just read. But perhaps you can give us a little bit more info on that.
Sure. Good morning, Leanne. Thanks for having me. The global carbon market, for which a framework is now agreed upon after many years or even more than a decade of negotiations, is to play a role in curbing down the emissions of greenhouse gases across the world. Let me demonstrate this by an example. Instead of a developed country somewhere in the northern hemisphere spending a lot of money to phase out its own greenhouse gas emissions from a coal plant, for example, instead of taking expensive steps in its own country, that country may now decide to invest in green energy projects in South Africa. So it may help South Africa to build a big solar farm because it may be a cheaper thing to do in terms of reducing its own emissions. Or such a country may decide to invest in protecting the Amazon rainforest so that that forest can continue to absorb carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere. So it is very much about trading emissions between countries. This can play a role in terms of boosting green energy investments in countries such as South Africa or in India. But we should realize that this on its own is certainly not the solution to the problem. In the end, and in fact very rapidly, we need to phase out all emissions coming from coal and oil across the world. So this can be seen as an interim measure that can help us with that transition towards green energy development in the developing world specifically. But on its own, the carbon market will never solve the global warming problem.
Certainly not. I mean, but if we have to look at how it works, perhaps you can give us an understanding of what the carbon credit is and how it's actually going to work.
Effectively, it means we have a certain carbon budget left across the world that can safely keep us below a global warming level of, say, 2 degrees Celsius. So there's a certain amount of carbon we can still burn, and we can keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Now, just a year ago, this argument was still being made by in terms of the 1.5 degrees Celsius level of global warming, which is now being exceeded. So there's a certain carbon budget that is being allocated across the world economies, across the nations of the world or the countries of the world. And that can be traded between countries. So, for example, as per this example I've already mentioned, a developed country can choose to keep its own carbon emissions going for a while longer in return for reducing the emissions of a developing country. And that concept can work, and its biggest value is in terms of sending hopefully billions of US dollars towards the developing world in terms of boosting green energy projects. But as I say, we should not see the carbon trading as a solution to the global warming problem, because it is essential that all emissions of coal and oil are being phased out. And the target date for that has always been the middle of the century, 2050. By that date, we need to achieve carbon neutrality across the world.
And buy-in from the globe. But critics are saying that approval of the climate credit rules on day one of COP29 was rushed. This is what they're saying as it sidelines debate and transparency in carbon credit standards. Do they have a point in that?
I guess it was a type of a backdoor deal But on the other hand, this is also the type of decision that can give momentum to a conference. And maybe it was important because this conference started on the back foot because of the fact that after the US elections, it is now clear, it is becoming clear that Donald Trump will once again withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement on climate change. So this was a positive event. I think it is helping more than it was harming this conference to have a good result right at the beginning of the event. So hopefully from that foundation, it will inspire the nations present at the conference to seek other important advances at this conference. The most important topic at this conference is in fact climate financing for the developing world. And the big question of COP29 is whether we will see progress in terms of climate financing becoming stronger for the developing world.
And this is the big problem, because I mean it also is something that we have to worry about. And when we look at the developing world as opposed to the developed world, it just looks like there's more buy-in from the developing world than from the developed world. I mean, we look at big prominent global leaders. You just mentioned the incoming president of the US, Donald Trump, and he has made absolutely no secret of the fact that this, for him, he's not interested in this. He really isn't interested in any of this. What has the US had to say about this?
Well, of course, the current envoy of the United States at the conference comes from the Biden administration.
Exactly.
So
there's going to be a change. I mean, so as
Absolutely.
much as the decisions that are made now, they could be a reversal come a next meeting.
It's unfortunately true that the US delegation at this conference of the parties is a lame duck, if not a dead duck.
Yeah.
They unfortunately have no credibility because of the fact that the United States will likely withdraw from this
Absolutely.
entire agreement at the beginning of next year. It will take about a year for that withdrawal to come into effect. But the hard reality is that the United States is needed. It's needed as a global leader in terms of slowing down global warming and in terms of financing the developing world to adapt to climate change, and in terms of financing the developing world to make this transition to green energy economies.
Yeah.
So without the United States and without that momentum coming from its diplomacy and the pressure it can exert on other countries if it should mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, without that, the entire process is losing momentum. It can be said that without a close collaboration between the United States and China, who are jointly responsible for 45% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions, the global warming problem cannot be solved.
It certainly can't, and that just stops the conversation dead in its tracks in this whole action. But I know that this year, just as a final point to be made, the UN Climate Conference is really about support for developing nations and finalizing some form of compensation to developing countries. How is the funding going to work? And this is one of the biggest issues that they're hoping to get out of this. But then again, as you say, is this conference going anywhere with so much change coming?
There is still progress that can be made.
Okay.
For example, we've seen that the United Kingdom has on day one, or it was in day two of this meeting, made a commitment of an 81% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2035 with respect to 1990 levels. So that's a major ambition shown by the UK. The European Union countries over the last several years have shown great leadership in terms of reducing their own emissions and also in terms of committing climate financing to the developing world. In China, at least, we see this massive rise of a green energy sector, and increasingly those technologies or those products are being exported to other countries. So there are positive aspects. But in terms of financing, without the United States, climate financing is going to be on the back foot, despite the best intentions of those countries represented at COP29. The US, even under the Biden administration, have always argued that its financial commitments must to some extent be matched by similar commitments coming from China and also from the very rich Persian Gulf states. But without the United States making that commitment in the context of its upcoming withdrawal from this entire agreement, I think the pressure is going to be off. China is going to be off the hook in terms of making similar commitments.
Well,
so we are on the back foot, unfortunately.
We are not the greatest. Look, it still goes on. The conference is still moving on for the better part of a week, so hopefully a lot more will come out of it, and there's a lot at stake on this particular one, but how much weight will it hold? I mean, if we look back, I'm not sure that too much has changed since COP28, but unfortunately we can't talk to that, but we will have more conversations. Prof, if you'd please accept another invite form from us to come in. Professor Francois Engelbrecht talking to us about COP29. He, of course, is Director of Global Change Institute at WITS.